I'm Kaja. I'm a Slovene freelance journalist based in Vienna. Okay. You can just get a very realistic shot of a mom with a fussy baby. I'll be joining in person. I'll also be joining with a very small baby, so depending on how fussy he is, I might be joining some sessions virtually from a quiet corner of the venue. Last year was my first time attending. So I primarily cover climate, everything from hard science news, science features, and then also kind of social and societal angles. For me, a good press release is really just the first hint that something interesting might be going on, that there's maybe a topic worth looking into. What you really need for a good story are great sources. You need someone, a scientist who is a good communicator, or you need maybe a really concrete case study that can really make a story pop. And that's something you come across at a conference. You get to meet scientists, you get to have a chat with them, learn the larger story behind their research, see if there's anything kind of weird going on that piques your interest, and also see if they would make a compelling interviewee and start that relationship of, building a source and hopefully staying in touch for a long time throughout their career. Sometimes it happens, in the Q&A session, the scientist just makes a throwaway comment that piques my interest, or maybe there's some weird anomaly in the data that makes me think maybe there's an interesting tension there, or there's a detail of a result that, the scientist won't even think is that important, but it connects to something else I'm thinking about and makes me dig deeper. So it's really kind of a gut feeling that makes me think, okay, this is a string I want to pull on and see if it takes me anywhere. Of course, there's a gap, but that's by design, right? The EGU is aimed at an expert audience, and a lot of that is simply not relevant to the wider public. It's the job of then science journalists and science communicators to find the parts of the data or find the information that's relevant and then communicate it in a way that the broader public will be interested in. So this will be my first time attending a big conference with a baby or a child. So honestly, I can't speak to other conferences because unfortunately it's one of those topics that you're just blind to until you need to know about it. But just based on that, I think it's fair to say that, the world in general could do better accommodating parents and carers. But of course, I'm biased, so. So I'm actually on maternity leave until September. My baby is just about to turn 3 months old. So the option was either take him along or don't attend this year. Luckily, I live in Vienna, and I know from attending last year that the EGU is very baby friendly and parent friendly. So I'm really looking forward to it. But of course, flexibility is going to be a big watchword this year. Yeah, so, actually one of the most interesting topics I ended up stumbling upon last year at EGU was parents in fieldwork and parents in geosciences. So I did end up talking to a lot of scientists about both their experience in the field as parents and how that's difficult, but also their experience at EGU. So I knew already that they have nursing rooms. I knew there's some, daycare for older kids, but also just after talking to the press team, they were very helpful in accommodating my baby's needs and also just making sure I don't disrupt proceedings, right, with a fussy baby in press briefings, etc. Yeah, so my main goal is really to meet up with some of the scientists I interviewed before, see what they're up to, but then also meet new people, attend sessions. It's largely about learning new things, getting ideas, and meeting new people. Thank you, and see you at EGU.